Okay, cool. So I'll take about half an hour. Maybe I'll be cheeky and take 35 minutes, depending on how much I have to say, but I will definitely not go longer than that. So I'm going to talk to you today about these two handsome fellas that you see on the screen before you. The chap on the left in the tweed jacket, some of you might recognize because he's becoming better and better known. There was a long period when he was very neglected in South African historiography and just in the national conversation. Everybody spoke a lot about figures like Mandela, but not much about Robert Sobukwe. So that's Robert Sobukwe. He was the founding president of the Pan Africanist Congress. And I will speak to you a little bit more detail later on about him. And he's standing next to a man called Benjamin Pogrund, who's still actually alive, lives today in Jerusalem. And at the time was a liberal card-carrying Liberal member of the Liberal Party of South Africa, and also a journalist for many years at the Rand Daily Mail, which was the largest sort of, I don't know if it's right to call it an anti-apartheid source of news, but it was certainly an English language daily that was very critical of the regime from a kind of liberal perspective. So if you were a critic of apartheid and you read the newspapers, then you were probably reading, and you were reading in English, you were probably reading the Rand Daily Mail. So I'm going to say a few. So my PhD essentially was about the relationship that these two men had with one another. And I know that now that I've been with the other doctors, the MD doctors, for the last 2 years, that for people trained in biomedical research, it'll be like, well, what were you doing? Were you testing a hypothesis? Were you modeling something? Can you make any predictions? All of those kinds of really helpful things that biomedical research can do and that physical sciences research can do. But the answer is no, I was doing none of those things. So I see my PhD was a kind of a intervention into a very politicized conversation that was happening in the national public sphere. So it's more of what I was doing was I was using historical methods. So I went into the archives and I read the letters that these two guys had written to each other over about a 10-year period when Sobukwe was in prison. And then I went and read very broadly in the secondary literature, so the literature on the history and the anthropology of the time period in which they were growing up and in which they became friends and started to write letters to one another. And then I used, anytime I wanted to say something controversial, I tried to use multiple sources, so as a kind of form of historical triangulation. But I wasn't testing a hypothesis. I wasn't modeling anything. I wasn't trying to predict anything. I wanted to make an argument about the importance and the brightness and the viability and the hopefulness of non-racialism at a political moment that I actually still think we're in, but that was very, very heightened in 2015 with the Rhodes Must Fall protests. And I wanted to do it using the relevant historical literature and using this friendship as a way into that conversation. So that's what I did. So it's much more contemplative, meditative, polemical even than the kind of research that you would be familiar with in the health sciences mainly, and in the biomedical model. So that's just so that you have a kind of picture of what I did and why I did it and how I did it. So just to say a little bit more about who these people were, who these two men were. So as you can see, my slides aren't in order because I'm an artist, not a scientist. So I'm going to be jumping all around my slide presentation. So as I said to you, Pogrund was a member of the Liberal Party of South Africa. He gave that membership up when he became a journalist at the Rand Daily Mail in the 1950s. because he was a man who was extremely committed to the idea of journalistic impartiality, and he felt that he couldn't really report on the struggle whilst kind of being an active political member of it. So while I would say that he anyway continued to kind of be involved in the struggle, he took himself out of being involved in any kind of formal political formation. So he left the LAPSA when he went to the Rand Daily Mail. Sobukwe was the founding president of the Pan Africanist Congress, and the Pan Africanist Congress was a group of young, the early ANCIL, so the early ANC Youth League members who were known as Africanists, and they break away from the ANC in the late 1950s over the Congress Alliance. So those of you who know your history will know what I'm talking about, but since we don't do a lot of, I don't know, we don't teach history very well in this country, and many people don't necessarily spend a lot of time reading it. If you're not aware of the Congress Alliance, they were an alliance of anti-apartheid political formations led by the ANC, and a very important member of that Congress was the Congress of the Democrats, which was largely composed or comprised of white members of the former Communist Party that had been banned and had gone underground. And then various other congresses like the Indian National Congress and other congresses who joined the Congress Alliance. And they produced that very, very famous document, the Freedom Charter, that was read at the Klipfontein, and I forget the year. I'm terrible with dates. But this is mid-1950s, and that document goes on to be a kind of a founding document for our Constitution, or a founding source for our Constitution today. And that document has this very famous phrase, "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white." And the PAC said, not so fast. It doesn't belong to everyone. It can't belong to equally to white settlers. So it can't belong to the people who took the land by force and controlled it through anti-democratic means, who the PAC also in their very colorful language refer to as the alien robbers. So Robert Sobukwe was the founder of that group of very fiery, young, very brilliant, often very educated anti-apartheid activists who were part of the Pan Africanist Congress, and who were really a significant force in politics at that time. Him and Robert Sobukwe meet in the late 1950s. If I have time later on, I'm going to tell you the story of that, but I can see time is flying by very quickly, and I'm speaking in more detail than I should be, so I won't tell you that story right now, but maybe in the discussion I can get back to it. Anyway, they become very, very good friends, and they exchange this series of very profound letters with one another during the period that Sobukwe was confined in solitary confinement on Robben Island. And that was for about 6 years between 1963 and 1969, when he was finally released and banished to Kimberley. And I just want to I want to very quickly read you something that they wrote to one another so that you can get an idea of how they felt about each other. But I should pause at this moment and say, obviously, like, if you're paying attention, this should already strike you as interesting. What is this man who belongs to a political party that is extremely critical of white liberals, has a lot to say about the interfering role of white liberals in the liberation struggle, and is basically splitting from the ANC because he doesn't feel, or they don't feel, that white settlers have a place in the future history of South Africa. What is he doing being bosom buddies with a card-carrying white liberal, member of the Liberal Party of South Africa, nogal. Anyway, so that you can see, and I discovered these letters in the midst of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, when all of these things were being debated. And let me just speak about that quickly, and then I'll go back to their letters to each other. So you can see why it interested me, because this was mid-20, it was 2015, it was the Rhodes Must Fall, it was the kind of rejection of and reckoning with the liberal democratic compromise of CODESA and the TRC, with the notion of a rainbow nation, with the notion of non-racialism, and in this moment also significantly the sort of political authenticity of young Black radicals or young Black activists was very much premised on the extent of the rupture between themselves and their white peers. And in the midst of all of this, I found this thread comparing Sobukwe to Mandela, Sobukwe being the real kind of authentic Black political revolutionary, and Mandela being the sellout because of his willingness to negotiate with de Klerk, because of his kind of personal friendships with white activists and so on. And I didn't know anything about Sobukwe at the time, so I went and I began to research him. And in the process of that, I discovered this friendship that he had with Pogrund, and I thought, well, this is, I mean, obviously there's a paradox here. There's something that's worth understanding. What is the meaning of a friendship like this, given the political views of the people involved in that friendship? So I just want to read to you quickly from their letters to each other, just so that you get a sense of how close they really were. So this is a letter, mid-1960s, written by Sobukwe to Pogrund, and he says to Pogrund, Helen Suzman visited me in here too, as you know, and she greeted me with the words, I was with your friend Benji yesterday. I was forcibly struck by the inadequacy, if not the incongruity of the term. I have friends, of course, of whom I'm very fond, but I have long passed the stage of thinking of you as a friend. I don't want to be sentimental about that. And Pogrund responds very sentimentally and says, both your letters moved me very deeply, particularly your second one. There's no shame, there cannot be any, in my telling you that I cried when I read it. I feel so very close to you, Bob. I recall constantly the last times we were able to see each other, of the many hours when we ranged in our chats over every conceivable subject as though we had never not been seeing each other. I've said before, and I say again, that it's little that I do for you and your family. You deserve a lot more. And so often I berate myself for not doing more for you. And so often I pray to God. That's how it is in the original without the G, because of course Pogrund was, the O, Pogrund was Jewish. So that's how they represent the name of God. That I had the power to act effectively on your behalf. I feel a terrible pain within me about your situation. So given the context in which this thesis arose, this sort of meditation on what the possibilities of friendship and solidarity across racial difference actually are, what the meaning of non-racialism is, whether there are liberal values that are worth holding on to or not, etc., etc. You can see in that context of the RMF moment why this friendship would be so interesting and such a puzzle. And what I want to talk to you about now is really my favorite chapter in the thesis, which was titled Friendship and the Making of Non-Racial Africanity. And in this chapter, what I was trying to do was to argue that this very close friendship that Sobukwe and Pogrund had, it wasn't a flash in the pan, and it wasn't an idiosyncrasy. In other words, it was reflective of a lived expression of Robert Sobukwe's commitment to non-racialism, because in that moment, the arguments that we were hearing was that non-racialism was really just a kind of colorblind form of racism, where you under the guise of saying that you don't see race, which of course all of us actually do see, even if we reject the notion or don't believe in it as a kind of biological reality, understand it as a social construction, etc. It is the water in which we swim. So it is part of all of our daily experiences and patterns of mind and so on and so forth. And I wanted to say that in that moment, there was a lot of critique of non-racialism and a lot of sort of naysaying of non-racialism based on a very particular deployment of non-racialism, which one sees in the sort of center and center-right geography of politics in South Africa today, which is where people, under the guise of non-racialism, try to stop any discussions or any forms of racial redress, using the argument that merely to talk about race is the same as being racist. So it then becomes very difficult to either articulate experiences or practices that are racist, or to do anything about those things, to engage oneself in any form of redress, because the argument is that any kind of invocation of race is racist. And what I wanted to say was, right in the heart of the Pan-Africanist tradition, there is an argument for non-racialism that is not a colorblind non-racialism. In other words, a non-racialism that is much more predicated on the idea that you can't know anything worth knowing about another person without really getting to know them as an individual, that you can't, that none of your actions towards other people, none of your patterns of thought towards other people should be predicated on the idea that you can know something worth knowing about them by just looking at their body, and then interpreting it through the constructions that are available to you in your particular historical moment. Because, of course, race is not something that's been with us since time immemorial. So I always say to my students when I'm teaching them the history of the construction of the modern concept of race, that if we were to go back in a time machine to ancient Egypt or something like that, go back 4,000 years or 5,000 years or whatever the case may be, we would all look different from each other. But the way that we made sense of what that looking different from each other actually meant for everyday life, for ethics, for politics, for material chances, for status, etc., would be very different from what those differences mean today. And that's precisely because race is something that is, it's very real, but it's real through human action. It's not real because God put it there, or for secular people because nature put it there. And we can argue about this in the comments section if anybody wants to, but that's, yeah. So I wanted to tease out Sobukwe's commitment to non-racialism, which was obviously hard because on the one hand, he was having this very deep relationship with this white man, and not just any old white man, but a white man who was, committed particularly to a liberal politics. And so that, and saying things like white settlers don't belong, they don't get equal claim on the land, etc., etc. So how do you sort of make sense of that? So I looked at the friendship in various chapters, and then I went on to look at the kinds of things that Sobukwe said in his speeches, but also a little bit in his letters. And what I found that he was one of the kind of, not the only people at the time, but one of the first people to really think about race as a position in a human-made hierarchy, rather than as a biological or theological fact about human beings. So for him, to be African was a question of being in the position of the oppressed in the racial hierarchy that existed at the time. And for that reason, he was very open that he considered working class Indians and coloreds to be equally African. In other words, he didn't consider any of those people not to be African, because all of those people were in a very particular position in the existing hierarchy. Of course, with differences, petty and grand, but they shared something in common as the oppressed. So it's a similar, it's got a family resemblance to the way that people like Steve Biko later start using the term black in a much more expansive, less biologically deterministic, less kind of linked to phenotype way of understanding what it means to say that someone's black. Or that they are indeed white. And so on the converse of that, the way that he understood white people and the reason why he understood white people not to be African wasn't because of our ancestry or because of where we came from or the fact that we haven't been here for as long as everyone else, but it was because of the position of whites as oppressors. So as people who took the land by force, either personally or benefited from the actions of other people who took the land by force and who controlled it for a long period of about 300 years through anti-democratic means. And this is what made white people settlers. And it was this position that Sobukwe was saying had no place in a future South Africa. So when he endorsed statements about the land not belonging to settlers, he wasn't talking about the particular people, he was talking about a particular positionality, and which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about it. Let's just see, where's my next slide? So, and what he does in his thinking is he establishes a pathway for people to move out of the position of settlerness or their position as settlers into a position of Africanness or a position as Africans through democracy and through an equitable distribution of land. So what he's saying is that just looking different from other people or being from another part of the world from other people is not what makes you a settler. What makes you a settler is the ways in which, in terms of political economy, so in terms of politics and economics, you inhabit a given social system. That's what settlerness is, or being a settler is. And those things are amenable to deconstruction. In other words, those things are not things that are given by God, and they're not things that are given by nature. They are things that human beings make and sustain through their actions and their attitudes and their laws and their conventions and their cultures and so on and so forth. For Sobukwe, and this is what explains what explains this sort of strange kind of, on the face of it, relationship, very deep, profound, I would say, love relationship in the Platonic sense between him and Pogrund, is precisely that he's able to separate Pogrund from his positionality and say, well, there is a way out of this positionality for you. So that everyone who's willing to belong in an equal and a fair way gets to be an African. And so that African stops being a kind of racialized category and becomes something else. So two things that he said in this regard that I think are very interesting. One was, these are both from his speeches. We aim politically at a government of Africans, by Africans, for Africans, with everybody who is prepared to accept the democratic rule of an African majority being regarded as an African. So in other words, it seems like there's a contradiction between this rejection of the Freedom Charter on the basis that it protects the rights of settlers to equally belong, and this idea that everyone can become an African. But actually, it's not that, because what he's saying is that there is a pathway through human activity for those people who are settlers in the now of 1960s to become people amongst other people, to become Africans, and not to retain that positionality as settlers. And the other really beautiful quote from his speeches is a very famous one, so some of you might be familiar with it, where he says, he's saying this now to people who are amongst the oppressors. He's addressing the oppressors. Here is a tree rooted in African soil, nourished with waters from the rivers of Africa. Come and sit under its shade and become with us, leaves of the same branch and branches of the same tree. So there's a really kind of deeply, I would say, constructivist approach here to identity and to political identity, and a kind of vision of there being through the deconstruction of material hierarchies and cultural hierarchies and so on, the possibility of a different kind of equality. Obviously, it's utopian. We didn't get there. We might never get there. We don't know. But I think it's a very beautiful and powerful kind of vision that kind of goes way beyond, as I said, the sort of insipid nature of colorblind non-racialism. So it's a much more deep and fulsome and rooted kind of approach to non-racialism than just saying we don't see color and we don't talk about race, which is not true. Nobody doesn't see color. Nobody never speaks about race. So we know empirically that that's not sustainable, never mind the other ways in which it doesn't really work. So I think I said I was going to take 35 minutes, and now I've taken 25 minutes, and I was a bit shorter than what I thought I was going to be. But I think that's fine, because I'm sure there's more than enough that we can actually talk about. So yeah, Taslim, I think I'll open it up. I don't know if you want to make a few comments, and then we can just go to the floor or go straight to the floor, whatever you guys think is best.
Thanks, Emma. I mean,
Sure.
that was very, very interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about that ideal of kind of a shared Africanity beyond biological race. And at the time, the separations were structural and stark. And now the argument could be that the separations are no longer structural from a legislative and policy perspective.
Yeah.
And yet we still seem not to have, I mean, we've made headway in certain areas, but if you look at wealth distribution and land distribution, we've made such slow headway that one could argue in some regards that there's been no headway.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you reconcile that wonderful ideal of kind of Pan Africanism, as Sobukwe aspires to it, with the real post-colonial attachment to kind of manifestations of power, particularly wealth and land, that persists?
Yeah.
What would Sobukwe say now?
I don't know what he would say now, and I think one has to be very careful. It's like many of these people, the ones who lived landed up disappointing us, right? So we don't know who he would have been if he had lived beyond the 1970s. But I think the crucial part is, I think the reason why we're not in the, I think there are many reasons why we're not in the utopia that he envisages. But one of the reasons why we're not in the utopia that he envisages is precisely what you're pointing out, is that we've deracialized the state, but we haven't really deracialized patterns of ownership. So the economy, the material reality of the average South African is not, for most people, is not necessarily that different than it was 30 years ago. And so what I think he would say is, because he was also a socialist of a kind, very critical of communism and very critical of the ways of certain kind of Western experiments in redistribution, but still a person who felt that we had to make active choices about how we shared land and how we shared wealth. What I hope he would say is that that's the part that we still have to do. But then the harder question is, well, how do you do that? Because a lot of that has to do with persuading people, with building social movements, with with kind of ongoing popular struggle. And it's not clear it's not clear that that's really happening right now. And it's not clear to me, at least, how one would incentivize it or build it. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's, we don't have an answer to it in the country. We kind of, there's a polarized conversation, and there's multiple positions one can adopt along the spectrum. Something else that struck me as you were talking, Emma, and this is my last comment, and then I'm going to ask you to respond, and then we open up the floor. Is I was about a few weeks ago, I was watching this video on social media where this activist goes into a school in a colored community somewhere in South Africa, and he asks the question, how many African kids are in this class? Put up your hands.
Right.
And none of the kids put up their hands.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's the sense that African, maybe it's coming out of our apartheid terminology, but that sense of Africa being a geographic space that roots us, grounds us in terms of where we're from, versus some type of kind of cultural, biological grouping that describes who we are. So that sense of, do we see ourselves as African? That sense of deep identity related to this place that we're from.
Yeah, I think that many people do not see themselves as African, and I think it's even worse than that. I think many people don't want to see themselves as African. I think many people aspire to be American, Australian, or European, or aspire to. So I think, and I mean, that's, to me, that's very clearly because the term African was always used in the context of legislation and policy and so on that oppressed and dispossessed people, and it was also always used, not always, but it began to be used by the time we get into apartheid. It's being used in a way where people think and are formalizing how you tell on the basis not just of people's bodies but also of their cultural habits and so on, who belongs where. So it gets a kind of both biological and cultural gloss as applying to some folks, but not necessarily to everyone. Even if you just think within those people who Americans would refer to as people of color. So even within Black people as a group, or in the kind of Biko sense of what that means, there's a sense that some are African and some are not. But I think that a lot of change is, I think changing that has two dimensions. I think the one dimension is a material dimension. But I think the other dimension has to do with changing the way people think about Africa, think about what it means to be African, think about the many different ways historically that people have been African. Because I think that's also in South Africa, we have a very narrow image of what being African might mean. But if you fan out across the continent, there's so many, not just cultural ways of inhabiting that, linguistic ways of inhabiting that, but even just in terms of people, of what people look like. We are there's more diversity of appearance and even just pigmentation on the continent in a way than there is really anywhere else. So I think a lot of it has to do with the way that we teach history in school. And then, of course, as I said, there's always that kind of skin in the game, material aspect to it. If I had, so two things I would do. If someone just gave me like millions and millions of rands and said, you can do whatever you want with this money, there are two things I would do. The one thing I would do, and actually neither of them really are kind of materialist in the kind of socialist or Marxist sense, but I think both of them would be really powerful. And the one is that I feel like we should have an exchange program for all children, where every school child at some point in their school career, maybe in high school, does an exchange with a family who lives differently, who speaks a different language, at home and lives in a different suburb or whatever, to the one that they're familiar with or accustomed to. So I think the one thing is about that. And I think the other thing is about really incentivizing the acquisition of African languages. And I'm not against English. I'm here speaking to you in English, partly as a result of history, but it's not that I'm saying we shouldn't be speaking English, but a real valuing and kind of, like if you think about in the British Empire, it was really a huge status thing to be able to speak Latin. And I feel like, in a way, one way to change the way we relate to each other is to make multilingualism and dialectalism, like, can you speak 2 dialects of Afrikaans or only 1? Like, to make that into a really sexy, high status thing for young people, that it's really a mark of distinction, of cultural distinction, to say, well, I can speak Afrikaans the way they speak it in Pretoria, but I can also speak it the way they speak it on the Cape Flats. And I can speak, you know what I mean? Like, to kind of get a sort of to, as a way of transforming who we are culturally, so we don't just have this culture where everyone, irrespective of whether we're white or not, just aspires only to be an American or a European. Yeah, but anyway, that's just me being very unrealistic, utopian.
I think you're on something there with the multilingualism, something that we can really kind of chew on. I'm going to open up the floor to any questions or comments. I think there's been some nice provocative statements made. Yes, Sikolele.
Hi, Emma. Thank
Hi.
you for the very interesting presentation. I have 2 questions. My first question is, was Robert Sobukwe's perspective on this topic, was it widely shared amongst the Pan-Africanists? Because I've come across Pan-Africanists who take the perspective that as white, they wouldn't want to collaborate with white people because even in your rejection, you still benefit from the system. Like, you cannot improve yourself. You inherently benefit whether you accept it or you reject it, right? And then my second one is, in your research, was there ever a utility to race as a social construct? And is there a utility in modern day for race as a social construct?
Okay, I'll go with your first question first. So there's always been a split, I think, amongst Africanists and Pan-Africanists between those who had a sensibility that was very expansive, who wanted justice, but wanted a kind of justice that would be able to serve everyone who was actually there. So in a way, who were like realistic about the fact that these kind of pale faces are here to stay, then we're not going anywhere. How can we kind of incorporate them into the texture of a just society? So I think there were always people who had that sensibility. So like Apim Da, for example, is a person who had that sensibility. And then there were always people who had the other sensibility that you're describing. So yeah, there were always folks. P.K. Lebalo, for example, might have been a person who more had the second sensibility, where there was a sense in which there was no possibility for collaboration. But I guess the way that I'm reading Sobukwe, and this might be me imposing my own desires on him, and I think as a researcher in the humanities, one's always slightly doing that. It's sort of very difficult to get away from that completely. But I think that Sobukwe wasn't just talking about collaborating with whites. I think he was talking about a society in which, in a very meaningful way, there would be no more white people, because for him, they were the outcome of a particular kind of hierarchy, not the property of a particular kind of body. And as I was saying earlier, when I teach the long history of the formation of race as a category, when I'm teaching in sociology, I make sure to include examples of times when all of the bodies and the variety of phenotypes that we see now would have existed, but they wouldn't have made sense in racial language. There would have been no way to understand power and status in the way that we understand it today through the way that we racialize people's bodies. So I think Sobukwe, we should use him to go even further, which is to say that let's have, people with Portuguese ancestry and Eastern European Jewish ancestry. Let's have Italians and Turks, but let's not have white people. I don't know if you see what I'm saying. And I realize it's a very unusual way for, especially a sort of old white granny such as myself, middle class Jewish white granny such as myself, to talk about race. People find me very disconcerting as a result. So I know it's going very far, but what I'm saying is I think that, as I said, I think that sensibility to fully deconstruct the conditions of possibility for race, I think that's where an openness to that has always been part of the Pan-Africanist tradition. And on the other side, a closedness to that has also always been part of it. And so it's up to us as, to decide which of those traditions we want to take up. Nobody can force anyone. And then your second question, now I've gone on for so long, I've already forgotten. Can you just remind me quickly? Oh, the utility of race.
Yes, the utility.
You were asking, well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by that. Like, I think if you're trying to, I guess it depends on, do you mean like in terms of like writing policy or redress, or like, what do you mean by the utility of it?
I guess I'm coming from it from a broad perspective, in that, is there a benefit for us to, or was there ever a benefit in its construction in the first place? And is there still a benefit going forward?
Look, I wouldn't say, if you go back into the kind of late, so race has a very long history, but it's not an eternal history. And I would say that it's difficult to talk about race further back than, say, the 1100s. And it becomes more and more possible to start talking about race when you get to around like the late 1500s. And then when you get to the 1800s, it's just about the only thing that people can talk about. Sorry, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not something, I can't see in that history a time when race was ever used to do anything except to justify dehumanization. So a large part of the impetus for racism happens in the late 1700s and the 1800s around transatlantic slavery, as many people here and possibly you would know. That's where we get a lot of our modern discourse around race, is around justifying, why is it okay to go somewhere else and take everything? Well, it's okay because we're not equal, so we don't have to treat these other people like they're also human beings. We can take all their land, all their resources, we can put them into shackles. So I can't think of a time, but having said that, I hear the other part of your question, which is that I guess that if you think about like the Black Power movement, or moments where people have needed to retake what it means to be racialized as Black and make it into something that you can have a positive affect from, culturally and all the rest of it, and politically. I suppose in that way you could say people have tried to have made it utile for themselves. But in the longer history, no, I can't really see it doing anything except justifying very unequal relationships between different groups of people.
Thanks. I'm conscious of the fact that we're winding down. We've got two hands, Ishak and Lebogang. So Ishak, I must just say, as Ishak unmutes himself, that you made some very strong comments here that I really find stimulating. Thanks in your response, which we can maybe take continue offline, but for now it's up here.
I'm just thinking, thank you. So first of all, apologies, I wasn't able to listen to the entire thing. So I kind of went in and out between walking with my phone and not catching everything. But what I'm hearing is I'm hearing about race, and the whole history around race seems to be rooted in colonialism. And colonialism, I mean, if I'm understanding my reading of history properly, colonialism is actually a manifestation of capitalism, because it's all about the trade routes and establishing hegemony over the trade routes and all of those things. And so we find race and colonialism coming out of that, and that's kind of moved towards in modern day constructs neoliberalism and neo-colonialism as such. So we have that on the one side, and then you've got socialism, and you've got communism on the other side. And my thinking is that from an African perspective, perhaps we might have a middle ground to lead the world with, and that for me, I'm thinking of Ubuntu, some kind of way in which we have, which I mean, we don't say that capitalism can't exist, but there's a social element to it. And so I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are in terms of from this conversations, the concept of Ubuntu. Was that something that came through, and how it came through?
So Sobukwe never speaks about Ubuntu. He would have been aware of it as a cultural concept, but he never invokes it. Which I don't think that, I mean, if you think about, there are ways of thinking about Ubuntu as a kind of spirit of grounded fellow feeling and generosity almost. And I think in that way, you could say that he is talking in some ways about Ubuntu. I mean, it's extremely generous to extend, to say to your enemy, I don't want to kill you. I want to give you a chance at a different kind of life as a person among people, rather than as a master amongst servants. I don't know what we do or don't have to offer the world, to be honest. I mean, as I get older, my faith in human beings anywhere and what we do and don't have to offer is radically diminishing. So I don't know, but I do think there's always been, if you think about African philosophy, going back to what the previous, sorry, I forget the name of the previous speaker, but mentioned about these different currents in Pan-Africanism. I think there have always been currents in African thought, and also, frankly, in European thought and in human thought, period, that are open and generous and expansive, and that want to provide the best that is possible for human beings within the constraints that we live in. Because obviously an element that we haven't spoken about all of this is you also make policy and you make political decisions within a set of constraints that you don't choose. And that means that not everything is on the table and not everything is possible. But yeah, sorry, I don't feel like that's really an answer, but that's my, I'm going to stop there because I realize there's another hand. And
Thanks, Emma.
Sure.
Lebs, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Just a short one. Thank you so much, Emma, for this presentation. It really helped me broaden my perspective a little bit about Robert Sobukwe's work and his contribution to these conversations. And I was thinking about this presentation in the context of the work that was done, book actually written by Dorothy Nelken and Susan Lundy, who writes about the DNA mystique, and particularly exploring how the DNA has been culturally mythologized. And often DNA portrayed as deterministic, moralizing forces, shaping everything from identity to social status and even destiny. And Robert Sobukwe championing African humanism, dignity, liberation, and Africanity. It's quite extraordinary to see within the context of genetic determination. For instance, the DNA is often framed as destiny or suggesting that behavior, intelligence, or social outcomes are rooted in genetic coding. And him rejecting all those biological fixed notions. Emphasizes that Africans are not inferior by nature, but rather shaped by political or historical context and his context for African humanism. And there's also the concept of commodification of the DNA. You know, for instance, we know about ancestry kits. So if glamorize how if you go do your ancestry and then you've got 2% European ancestry in you, somehow that's supposed to be a big deal. But I can now see how Robert Sobukwe's contribution in that process calls for agency and self-definition in contrast to the external aspirations to identity found in colonial or glamorizing colonial concepts. So yeah, it really broadened my thinking around that. And thank you for that contribution.
It's a pleasure, Lebo. Thanks for that. Can I just quickly say one or two more things, Taslim? I'll be very quick. So I was just as Lebo was talking, I was just thinking about another thing I would do if I had a lot of money would be that I would do I would really fertilize the teaching of history in this country right from the beginning. And it's got nothing to do with teaching people a particular political outlook, although I think it will impact that. But it's more to do with exposing them to the very dynamic, to how dynamic human history is. So, for example, if you go back, I don't know, in the 1300s, there's a trade between people on the east coast of this continent and people in what we now call India. And that trade includes money, it includes goods, it includes sexual relationships and marriages that produce children. So we've never been disconnected from the rest of the world. There's no, if you do a DNA test, it can tell you where your ancestors hung out, but it's not like that's not necessarily who you are in the present. So my ancestors might have hung out a lot, I don't know, somewhere that I have no relationship to, don't speak the language of, don't know anything about, right? So it doesn't really speak to the present, but by the same token, deep histories of mobility and change and cultural fusion kind of get erased through that sort of more biologically deterministic way of understanding human beings. So so it's just to say there's been so much that's happened on this continent. There's been so much movement in and out. There's been so much trade and connection to the rest of the world. And that we should know that, because I think that certain kinds of narrow chauvinistic politics, including amongst nationalists of all stripes in this country, are much harder to sustain if you know that history than if you don't.
Absolutely.
So I will stop.
I see Steve's hand up. So Steve, you're going to have the last comment, and maybe Emma will want to respond, or maybe we'll just leave it with your wisdom. Let's hear what Steve says.
It's wisdom. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Isaac's machine. Just with regard to your idea about high school kids, after the Second World War, I don't know if you know, there was a man called Kurt Hahn who started a series of schools called United World Colleges around the world, where they are deliberately diverse, introducing high school kids to each other for a minimum of 2 years. And those schools are still going. There's one on each continent of the world. And they do some incredible work. The problem is they're really quite elite schools, and they're not everybody. But just that your idea has actually been implemented over the last, whatever it is, 60 years, with really interesting results. But
Results, no, I'm sure. Thanks, Steve. That's really interesting to know, and it.
I think we've lost Emma's sound.
Yeah. Means it's the end of the seminar.
Emma's lost the sound and her camera. So, Alex, it's close to 2:00. I think the comments. Thank you for sending the comments, Angela and Sarah. I think this has really been a really fantastic seminar. Thank you, Emma, in your silence. But I'm happy that you weren't silent for 58 minutes, just for the last 2 minutes. I think this is the type of conversation we should be looking to having more frequently. And there I see Emma's back. So Emma, do you want to just say the last few words? You're muted, and then we'll say goodbye.
Unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so all I'm going to say is that the wonderful Sarah Crawford Brown is trying to, so the kinds of things I've been discussing today are the things that come out of a long formation in the humanities. It's what the humanities can bring that I think is of value. We don't have to agree, but it's the richness of like really knowing the long history of things and so on that I think can be really enriching to other disciplines that keep planes in the sky and treat cancer. We can also make a contribution. And I just wanted to say that Sarah and I have been talking about like how to offer our colleagues in health sciences the things that we've sort of gleaned from years and years in the humanities, and are really interested in doing something in that regard, like maybe a seminar. Nothing's been decided, but there is this feeling that there should be more of a cross-pollination. So I'd just like to close by saying, if you have enjoyed this, then the humanities is for you. You should contact either me or Sarah and see whether we can make a time when the wonderful scholars in the health sciences can meet with the wonderful scholars in the humanities and have these types of conversations, because there are lots more conversations like this that we're having. So, yeah.
Emma, that's a great way to finish off the conversation. Thank you very much. Thanks for your work and for your presentation. Thanks, colleagues, for the great discussions. Wish you all very well for the rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Remember to please send Jeroen your MP numbers if you want CPD points for today. All right, bye.
and then go to the arrow bar, and then press end meeting. End meeting, there you go. Oh. Yes.